And then Scout said, "Okay, Autovac, now you listen to me. Don't suck any more things." Or when Scout accidentally got turned into a squirrel, Scout says, "And I made a squirrel." Where Rocky Kitty says, "Hey, Deer Squad, look, that squirrel looks just like Scout." Where Kai says, "That's because that squirrel is Scout." Where Rocky Kitty says, "Scout? Is that really you?" Where Scout says, "Yes, it's me, Scout." Also, Rocky Kitty says, "It's working, Deer Squad." Where Rocky Kitty says, "But there's just one problem." Where Kai says, "What's that, Kitty?" And then Rocky Kitty says, "It says here, the spell only works if you find all the ingredients before sunset." Where Rocky Kitty says, "That's because the sun has already started to set." Where Rocky Kitty says, "We had to hurry before the sun goes down." Where Rocky Kitty says, "Oh no, the sun is almost gone. We had to hurry, or else Scout will be a squirrel forever." Or where Trixie says, "Hey, Deer Squad, hi to my kitten." Where Trixie says, "There you are. I've been looking all over for you." Then Marshall Kitty says, "Achoo!" And then Trixie says, "You guys, my kitty has spots on his fur, and he's really itchy. What's going on?" Where Kai says, "Sneezy and itchy. I bet I know where your kitty has kitty pox." Then he says, "Kitty pox?" Where Trixie says, "What's kitty pox?" Where Kai says, "It means when a kitty gets kitty pox. That happens all the time." Where Jade says, "Here, let me handle this." Where Trixie says, "Jade, no! That's too dangerous to use a crystal power on a kitty." Where Kai says, "I know. How about we can make that medicine and your kitty will feel better?" Where Trixie says, "I guess." Where Trixie says, "Come on, kitty, let's go." But Marshall Kitty wasn't following Trixie. He was fast asleep. And then Trixie says, "Kitty," and then Marshall Kitty woke up and he took one more step and he falls asleep again. Jay says, "Poor Kitty, I think he needs to go home and rest." Where Trixie says, "But I gotta go to the forest to make that medicine." Where Kai says, "Don't worry, we'll make that medicine for you." Where Kai says, "I have here the ingredients." Where Kai says, "So we need fairy dust from Sparkle Dust Mountain, one leaf from a flower, and last ingredient, one purple leaf from a tree." Where Kai says, "Ready, squad?" Where Trixie says, "The deer team will be here any minute with that medicine." But Marshall Kitty can't help it because he was too itchy, so Trixie scratched his belly. Then Marshall Kitty was too cold. Trixie says, "Okay." Where Trixie says, "And now you're hot." Where Trixie says, "Ugh, you're thirsty." Then Marshall Kitty said, "Meow." And then Trixie says, "Already." So Trixie bought him some water, but just to take a sip, he sneezed, and then the water ended up all over Trixie. Marshall Kitty says, "Achoo!" They said, "Meow." That means he says, "Excuse me." Trixie says, "Ugh." Then meanwhile at Central Forest, Trixie says, then meanwhile at Central Forest, Jade says, Guys, it's not just any flower, it's a tricky flower." Then the deer team says, "The tricky flower?" Where Bobby says, "What's a tricky flower?" Where Jay says, "A tricky flower is one of the most tricky plants in the world." And the tricky flower is really picky to be picked. Where Lola says, "Let me handle this." Where Lola says, "Whoa!" Where the picky flower grabbed at Lola. And the tricky flower grabbed at Wufu. Where Lola says, "Oh, help, we can't get down." Where Jay says, "Don't worry, soon as we figure this out." Where Jay says, did Jay says, "That's it, I remember the trick." Where Jay says, "If you want to pick a leaf, you have to tickle the flower." Where Jade says, "Okay, squad, ready?" And then Kai says, "Ready, Jade." Then Jade says, "It's tickle time." Where Jade, Kai, Rami, and Bobby has to tickle the flower to get Lola and Wufu down. And then the flower puts down Lola and Wufu. Where Trixie says, "What took you so long?" Or when Zuma Kitty actually tests out rocket skates, Trixie says, "Kitty, where'd you get those rocket skates?" Where Jade says, "Dear Squad, Trixie, we have a problem. Those super skates are called rocket skates." Didn't they say rocket skates? Where Jade says, "Once rocket skates starts going, they don't stop."